In the world of software today, you hear it all the time. Microservices are the way to go. It's kind of become the default answer for building anything new and scalable. But what if that whole idea is, well, wrong? What if the beautiful promise of microservices is actually a siren song, luring us all towards a whole lot of unnecessary complexity? Okay, look at this. 90%. Just take a second to let that number sink in. It's huge. And it represents a pretty shocking story from one of the biggest names in the entire tech industry. Yep, that 90% number. That's the cost savings Amazon saw on a piece of their Prime Video service. And how did they do it? By getting rid of a complex microservices system and going back to a monolith. Think about that for a second. Amazon, the company that basically pioneered the stuff and sells us all the tools to do with AWS, decided it wasn't working for them. That's staggering.
And here's the really interesting part. Amazon isn't some weird outlier here. They're actually part of a much bigger trend. We're seeing what you could call a great reversal, where some major tech companies are backing away from microservices and rediscovering the sheer power of keeping things simple.
So let's dig into that Prime Video story. The team there built a system that was, perfect on paper. It was serverless, it followed all the best practices. But in the real world, this supposedly infinitely scalable system completely fell apart at just 5% of the load it was designed for. It was just crushed by its own complexity. So what did they do? They ripped it all out and collapsed it into a single process. And boom, problem solved. Then you've got Twilio's Segment. Their system had just exploded. We're talking over 140 different services. Their own engineers called it operational chaos. Instead of building cool new features, the whole team was just constantly putting out fires. Their solution was just as bold as Amazon's. They merged it all back into a single monolith. And the results? Tests that used to take an hour were suddenly done in milliseconds. Their developers could finally breathe and actually get back to work. And then there's Shopify. They run one of the biggest e-commerce platforms on the entire planet. But instead of jumping on the microservices bandwagon, they made a really deliberate choice to stay off it. They use something called a modular monolith. It gives them all the benefits of clean, separated code, but without the absolute nightmare of running a massive distributed system. It's just a masterclass in choosing what works over what's trendy. So all of this begs a really important question. Why? Why is this reversal happening? Why are all these super smart companies running away from what was supposed to be the future? Well, the answer comes down to something we can call the hidden complexity tax of microservices. Let's just break down the fundamental trade-off here. In a monolith, all the parts of your application talk to each other with simple, ridiculously fast function calls. It's instant. With microservices, that same conversation becomes a slow, unreliable network request that can and will fail. You trade the rock-solid safety of a database transaction for something called eventual consistency, which is a fancy way of saying your data might be out of sync for a while. And you go from deploying one thing to trying to manage an entire fleet of them. And this tax comes in 4 painful installments. First, the operational overhead is just massive. Suddenly you need a whole suite of tools, service discovery, distributed tracing, complex monitoring, just to figure out what's going on. Second, developer productivity absolutely tanks. A simple change that used to take an hour now requires coordinating across 5 different teams and codebases. Third, testing becomes a complete nightmare. It's slow, it's fragile, and it's expensive. And finally, you get these data consistency headaches, where you're trying to glue transactions together across services, which is just incredibly complex and error-prone. Now, it's not just companies finding this out the hard way. Some of the most brilliant and respected minds in software, the very people who created the tools we use every single day, have been trying to warn us about this for years. David Heinemeier Hansson, the creator of Ruby on Rails, uses that perfect siren song metaphor. It's brilliant. Microservices sing this beautiful song about a future of elegant, independent services. But following that song very often leads your project to crash on the rocks of complexity. Then you have this from Jason Warner, the former CTO of GitHub. I mean, this is a guy who has managed systems at a scale that most of us can't even imagine. And he's saying that going full microservice was one of the biggest architectural mistakes of the last 10 years. That's a really, really powerful statement. And this one might be the most ironic of all. This is Nick Schrock, one of the co-creators of GraphQL, a tool literally designed to make working with distributed systems easier And he's calling microservices a fundamentally and catastrophically bad idea. He even says that entire companies will pop up whose only job is to clean up the mess that microservices create. Wow. So this really brings it all home, right? It forces us to ask a tough question. If an expert like the former CTO of GitHub, who has seen it all, believes that 90% of companies don't need microservices, you have to look in the mirror and ask, are we really sure that we're in that special 10%? Okay, so we've talked a lot about the problem. We've torn down the hype, but what should we be building instead? Well, the good news is there are some really smart, pragmatic alternatives that give you the benefits you want without all the pain. So, let me introduce you to the modular monolith. Now, this is not your old school, messy, big ball of mud monolith. No, this is a modern approach. You're still building a single application that you can deploy easily, but inside that application, you enforce really strict, clean boundaries between the different components. So you get that beautiful organization and separation of concerns without the crippling tax of a distributed system. And look, when you put them side by side, the difference is just crystal clear. With a modular monolith, operations are simple. Your data is always consistent, performance is high because everything is just an in-process call, and debugging, it's straightforward. Compare that to the distributed fleet, the network latency, and the data consistency nightmares of microservices. For most teams, the simpler choice is the clear winner. Now, there's also a great middle ground here. It's called service-oriented architecture, or SOA. The idea is instead of creating hundreds of tiny little services, you build a handful of larger services that are actually based on your business domains. So think one billing service instead of 10 different microservices for invoices, payments, and subscriptions. It gives you modularity, but without the absolute chaos. So really, it all comes down to this one question. Are you choosing your architecture to follow the latest industry hype, or are you choosing it to solve your actual business needs? The siren song of microservices is definitely loud and tempting, but the evidence from the real world is piling up. Simpler, more pragmatic choices are often the ones that will get you where you need to go, faster and safer. The choice is yours.